Welcome to the Reality Check. Psychosis is real, so is recovery podcast.
I'm Dr. Ashley Weiss. I'm a child adolescent psychiatrist.
And I'm Serena Chaudhry. I'm a clinical social worker.
And we are the co-founders of EPIC-NOLA, which is the Early Psychosis Intervention Clinic in New Orleans, and also the co-founders of CALM, Clear Answers to Louisiana Mental Health. Welcome to the latest episode of Reality Check. Today, we have the one and only Dr. Vinod Srihari, who single-handedly started the first episode psychosis clinic in the United States. Thank you very much. Called STEP at Yale up in the brutally cold New Haven, Connecticut. How are you?
Good. Thank you. That's very kind and not true. I wasn't the first. I didn't start it single-handedly, but I appreciate the sentiment.
Yes. We hold you in very high esteem.
In fact, I tell the story to all of my medical students who ask me how to find a mentor. And I was like, oh, you just cold call them. You just search what you want. In fact, you could find a really good article online and just start email stalking the author. And eventually they will write you back and have a call with you. And they're like, no, I'm not doing that. And I'm like, really? That's what you should do.
Yeah.
And that was on, what was the old software?
I think it was Skype. I think we had a Skype call.
It was a Skype.
Yes.
It was a Skype call, and there was technical difficulties even with Skype.
Oh my gosh. And look at us now. We're on Riverside. Wow.
And you have a microphone.
Indeed.
Yeah, so that's my advice, and I appreciate you answering the Skype call.
Well,
Now
not many people start with a phone call and then build an entire clinic and proceed from there. So it's been really a pleasure to watch and be a privilege to be involved in the story at EPIC-NOLA. So kudos to both of you and your team.
Well, thank you. And we thank you in our mind every day. So I want to hear what in your mind was, because I can't remember, it's been like 12 years, your impetus for building STEP.
Yeah, well, there are many versions one could tell of the story. I think there's a big role for luck, just contingency in these things. I was interested in schizophrenia. I did my fellowship in schizophrenia, but when I got my first job at the Connecticut Mental Health Center, it was in a chronic psychosis team, and there was an expectation as a junior faculty person that you were going to develop an area of work, of scholarship of your own. And other than knowing that I wanted to work with people with schizophrenia, I didn't really have a clear idea of what that would be. And it turned out that Scott Woods, who had been running a clinical high-risk program for many years, had previously tried to start a first episode program for those individuals who had converted or transitioned to psychosis, and was very interested in trying again. And there were others in our chronic psychosis team who saw the need for such a clinic. So I kind of raised my hand, and then I became the person who was sort of arranging the meetings and thinking about the practical issues and recruiting some clinicians to agree to form a team. And Scott was very helpful in getting me to write an IRB protocol and to think about applying for a grant, which was not my first instinct, honestly. I would have preferred to have run the clinic for a while and figured out what we were doing before applying for a grant to do a study. But I think Scott's nudge was very useful because it forced us to think about what we actually wanted to do and write it down. And once we had to write it down, it almost made it more real before it even was the case. So it got things moving faster than I think I would ordinarily have done it. I would have probably taken a long time to kind of figure it out and muddle along for a while. So I think the incentive to get a study organized and funded and run became sort of the big driver in some ways. Like once we got some initial funds and collected some data, that kind of built momentum on its own, and then we were off to the races. So since then, I sort of feel like I've been solving different problems, but it feels like it came from a kind of mix of luck and being in one place and arriving in a clinic with not a clear plan. So for people who are wondering how to get from A to B, I think my approach was moving from one point to another that made sense in the moment rather than having a grand plan and then, seeking it out.
See, Serena, we learned that from you. We learned that it was okay to have multiple iterations based on experience.
Absolutely. I think if it's a valuable problem that needs to be addressed, I think that, and you have a group of people who want to figure out how to address it, I think that supplies the momentum. Whether or not you get the funds you need and the supports and resources is actually, I think, secondary, because the challenges of trying to get that kind of support are only going to be met if you have a group of people who already want to solve the problem to begin with, and they're unlikely to be stopped just with a lack of funding. So in retrospect, I think that was the key driver, is that there were a bunch of us who just wanted to do something about the problem. And I think I just got picked to be the person who would perform particular functions within that role, which is to get the grants. And then once we started getting data, I got very interested in what that data was showing us. And I think maybe one thing I would say, and I didn't plan this in the beginning, but looking back, I think it was a good thing to have in place, was a continuous collection of data that allowed us to not just justify what we were doing, but also critique it and to look at gaps. Mm-hmm. And I think that has remained part of our DNA at STEP. And it only began because we needed to get grant funds because we couldn't find other ways to fund the clinic. But since then, it's become part of what we do because we find that it's a way to sort of demonstrate to ourselves that we're having an impact, but also to demonstrate to others that we care about whether or not we're having an impact in a very concrete way.
Mm-hmm. And you give yourself space to address the gaps and to improve the quality.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm curious, so in this journey that you weren't necessarily set on leading, but have become the leader in, at what point did you consider and then connect with Red Rock to create Mindmap?
Yeah. So that was an interesting story too. So when I wrote the grant in response to an NIH request for application, so an RFA that essentially invited researchers to propose projects to reduce the duration of untreated psychosis. So I was responding to an RFA. Mm-hmm. It had obviously occurred to us that this might be a problem we want to try to address, but the RFA provided a clear direction and incentive to organize ourselves around a specific aim. And the initial proposal included a different collaborator who was an academic with expertise in communications and whose focus really was on understanding how to communicate with different groups, how to message different groups, and had expertise in media and communications, but from a sort of an academic perspective. And we found over time that this approach was not working for us because it involved the use of lots of focus groups to bring people together to inform us on how to build a messaging campaign. And there were two problems with this. One, it was just taking too long to assemble these groups, and we didn't have the time to do this in a 5-year grant. But second, we were getting people in these groups who did not represent the target group we were trying to reach, because by definition, for a variety of reasons, they'd already declared themselves to be informed about or affected by psychosis. And we were designing a campaign to reach people who had not been identified as having psychosis. Right. And I got the strong sense that what they were telling us to do was not actually going to be the best way to reach young people with these illnesses. So, for example, advising us to not use words like schizophrenia or psychosis. Mm-hmm. And while these were clearly well-meant suggestions, it created a fair amount of confusion in our group because we then didn't know how to message and we ended up with very generic messages about mental health and mental wellness. So I was increasingly getting dissatisfied with that approach and becoming increasingly worried that we had this money, but we didn't have expertise in how to actually implement a campaign. And I ran into Glenn at a meeting with a clinic in one of our target towns and heard that he had been running a campaign for them around, I think, reducing problematic drinking. And I struck up a conversation and I discovered that he was really easy to talk to. And I got the sense he'd be easy to work with. And then I started sort of furiously reading up on marketing and social marketing to try to think about a way to justify how I was going to describe how we were going to do this to my academic peers. Because I didn't know anything about marketing, and it felt to me somewhat illegitimate to be selling our services as if it was a product. But I realized during the course of that reading that what was so refreshing about the marketing approach was that it was very flexible. We could try many different things. It didn't require a lot of focus grouping and surveys. There was a lot of a kind of an iterative, almost quality improvement approach to it. Try this message. If it didn't work, try another message. And it also was free of kind of ideology, I would say, about how people change their behavior. So I think there's a certain educational ideology that might come from educational psychology or even clinical psychology, where the idea is you educate someone that they have an illness, you let them know about the value of treatment, and then they get motivated to call the number and come for care.
It's just that easy.
As if, and in fact, I don't think that even actually works in many clinical samples, but it offers a kind of comforting, rational mythology about how behavior change occurs, although I don't believe anymore that that's how behavior change occurs. But there are many of these models, trans-theoretical models where you have different stages. And on the other extreme is the law, which is, I don't care what you know or think. If you don't change, you're going to go to jail. And that's another way to. But marketing, I feel like, sits in the middle, where it's a strategy to persuade people to do something without forcing them, but also without requiring that they be enlightened in order to purchase the product. That this seemed to me to fit very well with young people who don't want to come for care. They don't like what you're selling. So you need to sell them a bit on it. But they also, as part of their illness, don't believe they're ill. So if you're trying to convince them they're ill in order to come to care, you'll be waiting a very long time to make the case. And so marketing seemed to me to provide this perfect kind of model of getting people to do something that you want them to do, and also to help them believe that they're making a choice, which they kind of are. So I gradually became more comfortable with the idea, and then I started working with Glenn's team, and the social marketing approach provided a kind of theoretical background to enable me to then more comfortably embrace the various ways in which a marketing firm like Red Rock can deploy different ways of messaging and so on. So I had to go through a bit of a journey in my head, but I think the actual practicalities of working, it was a lot of fun. It was very creative work. Many different ideas could be discussed and tried. There was a refreshing lack of shame for failing, because we produced lots of messages that didn't go anywhere, that didn't land. And this is just the nature of communications at a mass level, where you don't meet your audience. You just are messaging out into a mass market, and you have to try many different things and hope that some of them stick for some people enough that you see a reduction in delay. So long answer to a good question, but sorry for going on.
No, I appreciate that. And I never knew that you had partnered with someone else before you landed with Red Rock.
It was a learning experience. And I think there are obviously other ways to do campaigns to reduce delay. And in fact, if you look at the literature, as I know you have, there is a preference for a theoretically based approach that is tied to a certain model of behavior change, in which one does one thing, measures whether it changes that thing, whether it's attitudes or knowledge, and then hopes that it measures and changes behavior. And I think another thing in reading the academic literature, and there is a very rich literature around social marketing for persuading in public health, I came to realize a very useful distinction between what some of them called micro and macro changes. So micro approaches to change behavior is where they clubbed all the psychological approaches that we learn as clinicians, approaches tied to CBT and motivational interviewing and trans-theoretical. They call that micro, because what a campaign needs is a macro level theory where you're trying to change behavior of people you're not meeting, not seeing, and many of them at a time. And they need to influence each other. And so it's a different kind of problem. And that's another reason why it was easy for me to sort of feel confident abandoning all these more respectable theories of change that as clinicians, we all feel like it's hard to give that up, because what are you doing then? You feel like you're doing random things. But in fact, if you look at the success that the advertising industry has had in getting people into certain kinds of clothes or certain kinds of glasses, who all believe they chose it, when in fact they're all wearing similar things at a similar time. So it couldn't have been such an individual choice, right? So this would be doing that kind of thing, but in service, hopefully, of not a commercial goal, but a public health one. So I've increasingly grown more and more of a partisan, I guess, to this kind of persuasion model for public health that's not tied to some kind of mostly mythical notion of how people's attitudes and knowledge needs to first be changed before they change their behavior. We just don't have the luxury of that kind of pathway for a problem at this level. And so what we're left with then is a very pluralistic, sort of flexible approach to messaging across multiple channels. But then what we have to do then, though, is be very careful about measuring impact, because if you can't measure a lot of theoretically driven intermediate outcomes, you at least need to show that you change the outcome you care about most. And then people can argue with you about why you changed the outcome. And you probably can't say exactly why, because you were doing so many different things. But if you didn't change the outcome, if DUP didn't reduce, I know that everyone would have 5 ideas about why we failed, because we didn't use this or that theory of change. But because we were able to reduce DUP and do it in a way that made it very hard to argue that it was a chance reduction. We had a control site. We tracked other events. It was very hard to say this just happened randomly. I think we've established that something about our campaign was involved in reducing it. And now what in our campaign is a different question that actually I don't have an answer for, but I also think it's not a question worth answering. So we're proceeding with the kind of the kitchen sink, multimodal approach to continuing to reduce delay and constantly measuring it over time to make sure we're going in the right direction.
For people that might be just tuning in, we developed CALM, Clear Answers to Louisiana Mental Health, based off inspiration from Mindmap. And I think it was pretty clear in the beginning that you couldn't just sit in an office, and that I think just being with people, being with people in the moment going through it, really, I don't know, I think it sparks some level of energy, and I have to go figure out why it was so hard for you to get here. I have to go figure out to make it easier or to try to, it's just so difficult, that first moment. And unfortunately, that first moment is a really long time in most people's life thinking about DUP. But I will say selfishly that being financially responsible, the idea of working with a group that already spoke the same language as what we were trying to do felt really comfortable, and that I wasn't having to sell anybody on this idea that this was really important. I wasn't having to go out and pitch something to marketing company myself. And so it felt really good just to be automatically have that shared language, and not language literally, but some shared knowledge or experience with talking about something that people often get really uncomfortable talking about.
Yeah, exactly. I think, we were lucky to find Red Rock. They're clearly public health mission oriented. And I will say it was a very useful exercise for us in the clinic to have to really explain to them why we wanted to say what we wanted to say. And sometimes to be told, if you say it that way, you're going to alienate or scare people. So can you come up with a different way of saying it? And I think this was a good discipline for us, because there is a curse of knowledge amongst us clinicians when we get very used to seeing people with these illnesses and speaking a certain language, sometimes full of technical jargon. And we lose sight of the fact that for most people out there, these are very unfamiliar states of mind, or worse, these are illnesses that incite fear and even prejudice. So we're working to educate people who are very different from the people we work with and spend our time with every day. And I think Red Rock was very good at constantly reminding us that if we really wanted to reach people who are not us, we needed to speak in a way that resonated with young people who had no context of clinical care and maybe didn't have much knowledge or had knowledge that was wrong and so on. So I think that process took much more time than I realized. And I do let other clinics and researchers know that when they hire a marketing team, even one that's as knowledgeable and aligned as Red Rock, they need to not abdicate their own responsibility to spend the time amongst their own team figuring out what they want to say, because that's still work that they'd have to do. They can't offload it to someone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the being with them in the moment and doing like the collective brainstorming has been the best part about the whole experience.
Yeah. And it really feels liberating to step outside of our day-to-day lives, our clinic lives, into this other world of marketing and to share our experiences with their ideas to come up with, I'm going to go back to a language or an approach that resonates more with the masses. Yeah. I think marketing is been a connector.
I'd say one more thing, you could argue that given the history of psychiatry or the darker aspects of our history, the misuse of psychiatric power to essentially incarcerate people, to misdiagnose people. We have a long history in the United States and not just in this country. You could argue that in some ways it's a responsibility of clinical services that believe they have something of value to offer in terms of improving outcomes to take some ownership of how to actually market this in the best sense of the word, to explain to people in language they would understand why their services should be sought. Because to presume that people would already know this, especially given what they've already heard in the media and still see in movies, is to expect a lot, given that the messages out there about our care are not good. And frankly, sometimes justifiably, we were critiqued, as a profession, I mean. So I think that I try to tell young psychiatrists now to remember that part of their job is to explain the value of what they do without assuming that people should already know it. And also to understand that sometimes they may know the wrong things about what they do. They may fantasize that what psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers do is lock people up, strap them down, shock them without their consent, all these fantasies that people still have about mental health care in the US.
Yeah, that's super true. What kind of switching gears away from the darker side, what has been like your favorite campaign that you guys have done, or like your favorite messaging that landed, or even it didn't land, but you just really loved it?
Oh, it's a good question. I think you get different answers from different members of my team. I'll say, this is a bit wonky, but my favorite experience in Mindmap was actually hosting an Ask Me Anything on Reddit. Because I went in with all these prejudices about Reddit. I thought I'd be trolled by people who'd say disrespectful things about people with psychosis, and I'd have to kind of shut it down. And what happened was nothing like that. It was a very educated group of people sending me text messages, sort of reading my responses, responding back, asking for clarifications. It felt like I was and I wasn't seeing anyone, I wasn't hearing anyone. It was all by text. And I found it to be an incredibly remoralizing experience, shall we say, because I think that there are communities in Reddit that have been formed and are quite supportive and well-informed. And so the questions felt to me like I was speaking to really intelligent peers who were not in psychiatric systems of care, who had genuine curiosity or sometimes critiques of what we did. So that was, I think, my favorite moment of the campaign, because I was completely surprised at what happened in a good way. In terms of others, I would have to say maybe the ads we put on the skins of buses that went around the towns was probably the community favorite. And I was surprised at the degree to which people were happy to have words like psychosis pasted on big billboards. And in some ways, it felt validating to us, because the feedback we had gotten from focus groups was a lot of concern about the use of words like schizophrenia and psychosis. But when we actually put these words out to clarify and to essentially take back control of these words and defang them basically as words of abuse, right? That this is what it is. And the feedback we got mostly from my clinician peers was very positive. They were like, it was so great. I was drinking at a fountain. I looked up and I saw a billboard with psychosis. And I was like, really? Isn't this great that we have it's out there? So I think that was probably the community favorite. Yeah.
Yeah. Those have been some really great moments, especially on the interstate coming around the Superdome at nighttime, where it was just like, psychosis is real, so is recovery. And this like beautiful picture. Advocate friends like text me and on their way home, that they just saw it.
I remember early on, one of our first bus ads, we were at the NAMI walk, and you and Michael and I saw the bus going by and we're running after it. So excited to see it. The bus going down Magazine Street. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's strangely gratifying, but so important, and people recognize it. Right? I imagine with Mindmap, there's this brand recognition that has evolved over time, and you hear people, not only speak about like seeing it when they look up from a fountain, but recognizing the repetition in different markets.
Yeah. I mean, you might be able to tell this better than anyone about how these words and their meaning may have changed in the community, or just making those words more acceptable in public spaces. I would like to think that people who have these diagnoses feel safer because they're represented in these public ways, right? I don't know if to the degree to which that's true, but I do think sometimes being afraid of these words is part of the problem, not the solution. And so I
100% agree. Probably talked with you at length about this in the past, but we kind of in the clinic, like we made that, decision to speak those words, and to like the way that they've developed such a stigma is because of what other people have attached to the word. Like it doesn't have to be us holding on to the reality that we attach our own meaning to everything that we say, including single words. And there's no reason that the word psychosis should be more difficult to say than, Serena. And and I think that anecdotally, and just like from our patient report, they like it. I remember being on it when I was an intern, and I remember working on an inpatient unit and being just completely shocked that the 18-year-old that we had with their first psychosis, that was a college student, that we didn't have like a big family meeting, that we didn't have a really big discussion about this experience for this person, what this might mean, where do we go from here, how to support the family that doesn't know, that's confused. Yeah. And it was like, an altered mental status. And I'm like, we can't even say it. Like, if we can't say it, like, what do we expect for other people to do? And so then their revolving door happened.
Yeah.
Because no one said it. Like, no one, and not to say, I'm sure that we both have a lot of people coming into the clinic that don't have schizophrenia, that don't have bipolar, that might have something else is going on, but they even in the moment appreciate saying, I have psychosis, I'm staying away from LSD forever. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I realize that this happened and it's not going to happen again. Like if it's, substance induced or whatever, but
yeah, no, it's great to talk with you. And I think as clinicians, we may want to keep it's not an easy issue. And what I mean is this concern about language and how it should and whether it should be policed and in what way it's misused and can it cause harm because of the way it's misused. And so I do think that with schizophrenia, for example, there are clinicians who don't want to use the word and hesitate making the diagnosis because they think that it conveys a bad prognosis. So they think it means that it conveys a lack of hope. And so sometimes delay sort of having a clear sense or communicating a clear sense to the family about what's required because they don't want to use the word. And I understand what that's like. And I appreciate because I have seen family members who've heard that term or said that, well, it isn't that, is it? And it would take a lot of time to work with them to help them understand that we don't mean this worst case prognosis that you have in your head when we use the term. We use the term because it helps us organize treatment to improve outcomes. So, but I'm sensitive to consumer groups and others who have articulated the sense that these words are sometimes used to other them and to marginalize them. And I can appreciate that if they're saying it can happen, it has happened. So,
Absolutely.
But I have not, in our work in our clinic and working with colleagues that I do, found that when we actually have worked with individuals with schizophrenia spectrum disorders or family members who are struggling with what to do about a child who's, at risk of going to jail unnecessarily because they're scaring the neighbors, that we are ever worrying about what words we use because the problems are not about language in that sense, right? So there's almost no words you could use to make it better or worse. So I struggle sometimes because I don't want to sound insensitive to the real harm that badly used words can have and do have in our communities. On the other hand, fussing about the words seems to convey the message that that's the problem, and it certainly is not, because there are real problems that families are dealing with. And you know what I'm saying? So I almost feel like I use whatever word they want me to use, and when people fuss about whether we should refer to individuals as consumers or patients, I use whatever words are necessary because that's really not what we're trying to solve. That's not the problem we're trying to solve in the end. But I'm happy to be disagreed with. And I say this, in as many fora as I can to leave open the space for people to say, well, that may be your experience in the position you're sitting in, but this is not what we want. I have not in clinical care, frankly, ever encountered a problem like with language, for example.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think that we all can own that we might sit in a place that, we do sit in a place with maybe a different vantage point. I remember you saying, when we were talking about the role of peer support specialists and how, it's a super valuable role, then they get to use their lived experience, but it's not to assume that no one else in the room has their own lived experience. I have my own lived experience of having losing someone to psychosis and, was in my family. And a lot of how I engage with my patients is, because of I can easily kind of be in that moment and feel, and empathize. So you can be aware of your role and maybe your privilege in the role, but also in the moment of also taking ownership of what you believe in. And I see, kids and young adults and they don't want anything sugar coated or want to be up.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of appreciation for being direct and being clear.
I had a faculty mentor who said we are all temporarily enabled. We're headed to various kinds of disability, all of us. And we don't even need to talk about the future. I mean, many members of my team, all of us have either been in the past, are currently, or will be patients or consumers of healthcare services. It may not always be psychosis. It may not always be a mental illness, but there's a sense in which this is also an illness like other illnesses. And so while it is distinct, it helps to not make it so unique that it doesn't benefit from the experiences of people who have all kinds of chronic illnesses, of which we should fully expect that everyone is part of that world, right? Everyone who has a body. So I do, to your point, those with lived experience of psychosis are incredibly valuable voices in our work. And we should find many different ways to welcome them. we should also not shut out the voices of others who are speaking from different perspectives that could be helpful,
Right.
even when it's not directly relevant to the person sitting in front of them, right? We all want all our humanity to be part of the mix of services we provide. Yeah.
So kind of thinking ahead, there's so many questions I want to ask you. Do you have like any additional mission with Mindmap? I mean, you guys are in your next iteration. Do you have any personal goals with
Mindmap 2.0?
2.0?
So, well, other than the fact that 2.0 is targeting 169 towns, whereas 1.0 was targeting 10. So this is a big effort to scale, which we're very much in the early stages of. I think where it's going to is vision of a statewide learning health system, where I think the best example I can point to that I hope is still the case is pediatric cancer, where as an individual patient yourself or a family member, you fully expect that when you go to a clinic, you will get the best available care, but that will also be the clinic that will make available to you participation in research when the best available care is not good enough, right? That there's a complete integration of missions between the best clinical care and research. And these are not alien to each other. They're not in conflict, although they are different buckets of activities, right? That are often led by different kinds of people. So the goal is to build that statewide, where currently we're focused on just really improving access through Mindmap. We are going to move to improve care quality, but we're also going to integrate in that, giving individuals with psychosis and their families the opportunity to participate in improving our knowledge for the benefit of others and maybe even them. So this is the grand vision, to model this at the level of a state. And hopefully the results will speak for themselves, and that might be a model for other regions, to replicate.
Yes.
Exciting.
That sounds like a similar mission.
Indeed. Yeah. So am I allowed to ask you guys a question?
Yeah, go for it.
What's next for EPIC-NOLA? Where do you see yourself in the next couple of years?
Everywhere. across Louisiana and in California.
I mean, I think it's just amazing that it was so fun to be at IEPA with you and with the Norway group, and to have like similar passion about this, which just tells me that it's possible, right? It's like possible to collectively come around, center around this like mission, so to speak. But yeah, we want for people throughout Louisiana, I mean, even beyond Louisiana, to like feel comfortable knowing that like they know where to go for this. And they know that they can come, even if it's just a question of this, and be, assisted one way or the other. And I think getting into some of the areas in the state that have different struggles and trying to understand how to communicate with them, which might be different than New Orleans, is a big goal. And then even beyond, I mean, we've been pretty shocked by like the social media relationships of people that aren't even from here, that can really increase your reach, so that you're simultaneously intentionally trying to reach your referral demographic, but also just, reaching people in general.
Yeah.
So I would like to think in 2 years that we have our fully operational mobile first episode psychosis unit, not a unit, really cool
vehicle.
And we want to go places and go on tour, providing EP care and
education.
And so in 2 years, Serena and I, and maybe if hopefully our team will get as excited about driving across the country in said van as we are, but
we will have driven across the country at least once, if not twice.
Doing CALM pop-up events.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll come up to New Haven and we'll just
that would be great. That's a really neat idea. Would you consider using it around Louisiana to do what the Norwegians did? These early detection teams they sent out to rural areas.
Yep.
I'm even trying to figure out how I can have a clinic. I mean, first of all, we have to get a van, but I want to go out and about, and I actually have telehealth en route to go somewhere far away to see somebody. I mean,
the potential here is so great. And I think, I don't remember if I've talked to you about, we've done a couple of CALM pop-ups in California that have been super well received. And I was fearful, nervous that people were going to ask why this Louisiana campaign was in San Diego. But the reality is that the message is the message. And psychosis, whether it's in Louisiana or in California, and being able to talk to people about it, create spaces for people to ask questions and to educate, that is real and necessary everywhere. And so how do we, as people who are passionate about spreading this message and helping direct people's pathways to care, how do we just get out there and do more of this? Clearly, Ashley and I are going to watch for.
No, that's really great. I love it. You CALM in California. Yeah.
So hopefully we'll see you again in Berlin. But I think it's really amazing what you've done, and
right back at you both.
Love that we could kind of do it together now.
Yeah.
It's fun to be in conversation with like-minded people and inspired.
Who are you planning to have on next? Do you have a list of guests that you have in mind?
Whoever that you think would be most valuable to come on, we would love to. Or not most valuable, but available and excited.
Yeah.
We're really just wanting to, expand the conversation and draw different people in. So we're looking locally and beyond. So we're open to ideas, to you and to all the listeners.
Yeah. And what I can think of people, what kind of audience are you hoping to target with a podcast?
Gosh, I give like the same answer all the time. I feel like I don't know. Like I really everybody from their own vantage point. And I mean, I say that honestly because I'm not a marketer, and I feel like every person, and it sounds so melodramatic, but like every person has their role or their responsibility.
It's true.
They're a part in this
society,
in this reality that we've created, where a lot of the people that we are involved with and care for, like, would have never had a chance like 30 years ago, 20 years ago, you know, like it's it's just true, and so everybody kind of has a role to play, I think, with like youth and young adults.
Yeah.
So whoever wants to listen and can get, their perspective or take something from it, I think is a drop in the bigger bucket. And that seems valuable. This past weekend, my brother, who's a chef turned artist, had a couple of our patient artists at his gallery. It was Artist Sunday, and he let them, they like set up their work, and he came in the week before and did some talk about, his experience and shifting gears into the art world and kind of the mechanics of it, right? Like getting your stuff printed, getting it prepared, like going to markets, doing these things. And, we had 3 people come, and not a lot of business, so to speak, but they were, first of all, the artists that were there. One of them was like, I'm just glad. Jacob was very apologetic. Like, I'm sorry you didn't make a bunch of money. And he was like, I got everything printed and framed. Like, I've been trying to do that for years and I got it done. So he was happy. Like, everybody had their moment. And then someone very close to his gallery comes over because saw the word psychosis and like shared, like, was like, what's going on? And they had a psychosis before, had like a psychotic episode, and was so happy to interface with Jacob. Like, I mean, it just, these connections happen that might seem small, but I think.
Yeah, sure.
Or
for every person who feels more comfortable talking about it, I think that's progress.
Yeah.
And for every action that's made, whether it's someone with lived experience or someone who's been a caregiver, that's progress.
No, I think there's great value. continually impressed with how poorly we've done as a medical community, a behavioral health community, educating people outside healthcare systems and perhaps even within about these illnesses and the treatments for them. So
I'm laughing
it's
at
a very
Bosch
cute
and
cat.
I know we're just being real here, but this is happening in my in Den. But I am continually impressed at that too, Vinod, and I kind of I hope after my life and when so I know it's probably not going to happen in my lifetime, but definitely in the next 50 years, we'll be doing a better job as a whole.
Yeah. I mean, there is something really, truly mysterious about these illnesses. I would acknowledge, when it's your liver or your knee or your kidney, I think most of us would accept that we don't know the physiology of these organs and we're willing to try to understand what's going on, but we don't expect that we would fully understand it because we haven't, if we haven't gone to medical school, or even if we have, we are willing to acknowledge that these organs work in ways that are not easy for us to understand, right? I think when it comes to the brain, I think many people feel like they should know more, even though they haven't studied the brain. And for those who do study the brain, I think there's a sea of ignorance about what is going on in this complicated organ. But there's something about losing control of one's mind that feels unacceptable. And in that context, I think we have a harder task as clinicians that are treating these illnesses to both acknowledge that we're ignorant about the brain, but to also educate people to say, well, that's not the end of things. There's a lot we do know that we can be helpful with, because in fact, we treat many illnesses without knowing a lot about how they arise and how they work, and we're quite successful at them. So in that respect, it's not that different. We're actually have treatments that are quite effective. They're not perfect. They don't cure, but that's true of blood pressure, diabetes, cholesterol.
Yeah.
But I think what gives it a particular spin is that it's an illness that affects a person's sense of themselves. I think there you want much more than just an account of how the kidney works. It feels much more personal. I think we are very far from providing something like that. So I acknowledge that even though we feel like we know a lot and can do a lot, it feels like very little to someone who's facing a child who's just completely changed as a person. And I think there, like, brain language doesn't quite fit with mind language, and it's a big gap that exists. And we need better metaphors. We need better ways to explain it. And we need more research to actually learn more about how these things actually occur. Yeah. So
that's very well said.
I could keep talking about this forever, so I do want to let you stop me. But it's great you're doing this, and I think podcasts can be a very useful way to get information out that's very different from reading and watching, right? It's more intimate. So hopefully you'll keep doing this and you'll let us know how to do it better.
Well, yeah, hopefully we can be
us.
guests. Yeah, we'll be guests to the first Mindmap.
Of course, indeed. If we figure out how we're going to do this, you're pioneers, at EPIC-NOLA. We're still trying to figure out.
We were basically in marketing jail for a little bit because they were like, you are not doing what you said that you were going to do with the podcast.
You need frequency, you need consistency.
Right.
Serena and my collective ADHD was...
I think we have a plan moving into 2025. Thank you for helping us enter this new phase.
This is I know we're on a behavior plan.
Yeah.
Serious. This is, we are. And so we earned our reward. We earned our stickers today.
Well, I'm glad to have played a small role, and I hope this takes off and keep going. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great seeing you.
All right.
Yeah, great seeing you. We'll see you soon.
Okay, have a good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Until next time, thanks for taking the time to get your reality check. And remember, psychosis is real, so is recovery.
If you have enjoyed this episode or found it useful, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from and check out the website calmnola.org.